And we are ready to start with Mr. Martin Palmer, who is the founding president of FaithInvest. And Mr. Palmer, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It's a really honor to have you with us today, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Georgia, and it's a great joy to be with you all. I've worked with the Orthodox Church since 1987. I was Prince Philip's religious advisor on the environment for 35 years, and as you probably know, he was brought up Orthodox for all sorts of slightly dodgy reasons, i.e. that his father was the King of Greece, which was not the greatest of CVs, should we put it that way, but he found within the Orthodox tradition something that he did not find in my own tradition, Anglicanism, a depth that when we started work in 1986 and we brought together for the first time ever 5 major religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, and Islam, in Assisi with all the major conservation groups, WWF, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, you name them, everybody was there, World Bank, UN. He had a very strong sense that the Orthodox Church had a very different sense of what it was to be a Christian, to be in relationship with nature. And when we started in 86, there was a lot of talk at that time that Christianity and Judaism were to blame for the environmental crisis, that we had so elevated the status of man, and in those days, that's what they said. We would now be somewhat more inclusive, but I think probably historically it's more accurate to say it was primarily men who thought they were the center of the universe and behaved as though everything was here for them. And what orthodoxy brought into this was a completely different understanding. And the first time I really encountered it was on Patmos, the island where, of course, the book of Revelation was revealed, if not actually written. And that was a meeting that was hosted by the then ecumenical patriarch Demetrius and the wonderful, beloved late John of Pergamon, Metropolitan John of Pergamon, who frankly was the driving force that brought the Orthodox movement into the environmental movement with such wisdom, such force, such passion. And I think that the thing that most struck me in working with the Orthodox Church was that you overcame the issue of whether the whole of creation was for us, which is a very much a Western notion. You know, everything is here. You'll hear an awful lot of people say, well, of course, all the religions believe in stewardship, don't they? No, they don't. No, they don't. Vast majority do not believe we're here to be stewards. Stewards are just managers, for God's sake. Stewardship is not a sacramental. It's not a spiritual relationship. It's a managerial role. And that's been half of our problem, is that we've thought we could manage the planet. We can't. It's far too amazing and wonderful and treacherous and astonishing for that. But we have elevated ourselves to the status. But Orthodoxy puts it very differently. I love the prayers for Christmas Day, in which you give thanks that all the elements of the universe contributed to the incarnation. So the heavens, the cosmos gave the stars, the angels gave their song, the earth gave the mountain and the cave, the soil gave the wood of the trees that made the manger and the grasses that provided the bedding for Christ. The animals gave their breath and their warmth in the cave. And what did we give? We gave the womb of Our Lady. So the incarnation is a cosmic event. It's not just human beings. And if you look at, it's very interesting, if you look at medieval paintings of the Nativity, it's full of animals and creatures and butterflies and bees and lizards, all kinds of creatures around Our Lady and Joseph and the Christ child. As you move into the sort of Protestant period, most of nature is exercised. You're lucky if you get a sheep, a goat, and an ox, and that's it. We've removed the rest of creation from the narrative. Orthodoxy hasn't. You have maintained it. And I had the great joy of working with Metropolitan John of Pergamon, and then later with Bartholomeus, the ecumenical patriarch, and also with the nuns at Ormelia and the monks on Mount Athos. We did the first ever environmental survey of Mount Athos in the 90s, which revealed the degree of damage that had been done by bad forestry practice, and were able to institute, with the help of all the monasteries bar one, the one that doesn't talk to anybody else, in order that we could actually have a whole process for restoration of this astonishing nature reserve, which is also a reserve of our relationship with nature. And out of that came the first ever thoroughly Christian statement on the environment, which is the Orthodox statement, Orthodoxy and the Ecological Crisis. An astonishing publication brought out in collaboration between the Ecumenical Patriarch and WWF. And that signified precisely what was needed. The Orthodox Church had the wisdom, WWF certainly does not, but WWF had some of the information that was necessary to help us understand. And I think one of the important things to remember as religious people is that it was not the religions that played the role of being prophets about what was happening in the environment. It was the environmental movement. It was the environmental movement that played the role of Amos and Hosea, Jeremiah and Isaiah. They spoke the truth brutally sometimes, crudely sometimes, that things were deeply wrong. And that evoked from the faiths, and particularly from the Abrahamic faiths, though increasingly from other faiths over the years, a recognition that we needed as religious people to respond. But what was the key response? The Orthodox response, I think there are two nuggets of wisdom that are in this document. The first one is that we are called to be priests of creation. Now, I find within certain Christian traditions, people go, oh God, not more priests. That's the last thing we need. But actually what we're talking about here is a dethroning of humanity from the center of the universe. Because in the wonderful words of this document, this is how it's described. Just as the priest offers, as priest at the Eucharist, offers the fullness of creation and receives it back as the blessing of grace in the form of the consecrated bread and wine to share with others, so we must be the channel through which God's grace and deliverance is shared with all creation. And this is the crucial line. The human being is simply, yet gloriously, the means for the expression of creation in its fullness and the coming of God's deliverance for all creation. In other words, it's not about us. We're simply a channel. And I often use that phrase about being a blessing, which comes from this, because so often the environmental movement is bad religion. It's very good on sin. It's very good on guilt. It's very good on apocalypse. It's absolutely crap on hope, redemption, liberation, salvation, whatever phrase you want to use. Very good on telling us how bad things are. But you can't just tell people that things are bad. You de-skill them. You take out of them the spring of life and the hope. Good religion does say things are not great. And then it says, and this is how we can move forward. This is how we can be changed. And our change can be the change for the world. So very often I will say to particularly rather earnest Protestant groups, very deeply into sin and guilt, along with the environmental movement. Now, I want you to sit here and think about in what way have human beings been a blessing to the rest of creation? And in what way could you be a blessing to creation? And usually they kind of go, oh, whoa, hey, But if we aren't able to think that we could be a blessing, that we are part of what God wills, not rebels against what God wills, we're ending up in a pretty bad psychological place, which is where I would argue much of the environmental movement itself has arrived. I think the other great thing about Orthodoxy, before I come to the final piece here, is that you understand better than almost any other Christian tradition that we are storytellers. Let's think about your iconostasis. In the average Protestant church, you're lucky if you've got a pulpit. You've got the Bible, but you haven't got that wonderful iconography. You haven't got all these saints with all their amazing stories, with all their human touch, with all their frailties. One of my favorite icons is the thief who used to go and pray to Our Lady every day that he'd be all right when he did his robberies. And then one day the icon started, Our Lady started weeping, and he realized he was hurting her. And that's what changed him. Those stories are what changed people, not the data. Nobody was ever converted by a pie chart. So all this data that pours out that nobody reads, but everybody synthesizes and simplifies. No, that's not how we're going to change the world. We're not going to change the world because the data is only as much use as the context into which it goes. Data has no narrative of its own. The narrative is supplied by us. And orthodoxy supplies a narrative of hope, of possibility, but it also, and this is quite rare, actually talks about sacrifice. And this is the other point I just want to share. We must attempt to return to a proper relationship with the Creator and the creation. This may well mean that just as a shepherd will in times of greatest hazard lay down his life for his flock, so human beings may need to forego part of their wants and needs in order that the survival of the natural world can be assured. This is a new situation, a new challenge. It calls for humanity to bear some of the pain of creation, as well as to enjoy and celebrate it. It calls first and foremost for repentance, but of an order not previously understood by many. Orthodoxy gives us a vision of our place that is exciting, that is hopeful, that is challenging. It asks us to be humble. It asks us to be powerful by being this channel, but not thinking that we are the channel and that we have the power. It's simply that we're here. Use us. And finally, I think the main thing I would want to share is that it is about our being in relationship with the whole of the rest of creation, and that we are called to say the most massive thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Palmer.